Here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a conversation, a discerning conversation about the ministry and the vesture of a Eucharistic minister. So this is, there have been a couple of changes about how we use Eucharistic ministers at St. John's that have been rolling around in my head for about 2 years now. And then the work I did on my current book, the 21st Century Parson's Handbook, made me rethink some of that even more so. And it's the sort of thing that I could kind of make a few adjustments and be like, this is what we're going to do. But rather than just do that, since to me, the reasons behind each approach are kind of interesting from a theological standpoint, I thought it would be enjoyable to get together tonight, for me to run through some of this theology and history for you, tell you kind of where I'm thinking, and also get your feedback, what you think about how we do it, how we could do it, and what you think would be a good approach to it. So does that make sense? That's our plan for tonight. So what I've got is a kind of a lecture teaching that'll go through a good amount of time. And then after that, we'll have time for discussion, kind of talk through what we want to do. As I'm going through the lecture portion, though, if you do have questions or things you're curious about or you want me to say more about, please feel free to kind of raise your hand and let me know. And I'm happy to do that. If these fans are too loud, I can drop them down a level. If they're a little loud right now, everyone's okay. No, I can hear okay. They're good. So let me know because they are very loud, powerful fans. But we'll go ahead and charge ahead. And we do have Tom Johnstone online with us, and Rebecca Taylor will be joining us online as well. So Rebecca's not on yet, so she might wind up looking at the recording later if she needs to. So let's dig in. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, our gracious Father, bless the servers of your church, that they may so serve before your earthly altar in reverence and holiness, that they may attain with all your saints and angels the joy of serving you and worshiping you before your heavenly altar. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So that prayer is from the 2003 edition of the book Occasional Services. And the fact that it's from that edition already becomes a part of this conversation. The current book of Occasional Services does not have this prayer in it because I want to say in 2018, they made a revision to how we do the blessing or commissioning of ministries in the church. Before that, in 2003, there were all of these liturgies that we had. Liturgy for blessing a warden, a vestry member, commissioning church planners, commissioning singers, commissioning Eucharistic ministers, all of these, there were literally like 18, 20 of them. And then the thinking on the Standing Committee for Liturgy and Music was, what commissions you for ministry is your baptism, not any extra special ceremony in the church. And so they got rid of them all and made a really small ceremony. If you basically saying, if you must do this, then maybe just say this short prayer instead. I'm still not sold that that was a good idea. I found those older services really meaningful for acknowledging distinctive ministries people may undertake as a baptized Christian, even though I understand the theological reasoning that you already commissioned for ministry by baptism. You don't need another commissioning. So, but what that gets to is our church has always been wrestling ever since the 1979 prayer book with this question of what does it mean to affirm the ministry of the baptized in practice. And so a lot of what we're going to go through today is kind of our church working through that and doing that in some different ways. We've got some goals for tonight of things that I am hoping we will accomplish. We're going to talk about the theology behind the service of a Eucharistic minister, where that comes from in our church, why that comes from in our church. We're going to talk about the history and practice surrounding vestments for ministers at both the offices of the church and at Mass, because that's related. And from that, what I want to do is determine if we want to change our customary of liturgical action and also our own approach for vestments for a Eucharistic minister, given those first two conversations. So that's kind of the goal. Does that make sense? Questions? Yeah, Nancy? Where, for example, currently, hi, Amy, welcome, come on in. Hi, Casey, hi, Rebecca, welcome. So currently, when the ministers go in, Oh, thank you, Nancy. So Nancy asked that this, it says to change our customary of liturgical action. What is that? So St. John says a customary, which is how we do our services. It's a very fulsome document. You can order a paper copy if you want. I'll even sign it for you. And currently in our customary, when a Eucharistic minister enters, they go up the chancel steps at the 10 o'clock service, they reverence and go directly to their pew. Whereas the priest and deacon go all the way to the altar for the joint reverence. That's our current customary. One way of doing that differently would be to have the Eucharistic ministers go with the priest and deacon to the altar for the reverence, for example. So that's the customary question. One of the customary questions we'll be looking at. That's what that's referring to. How do our Eucharistic ministers move in the context of these liturgies? Yeah, Greg.
So I remember growing up, as I'm told, before the 1979 prayer book, there were no lay ministers.
Yes. Yes. And that's why if you've ever been at St. John's, when we've done one of our historical liturgies on an anniversary Sunday, when we use the old prayer book, you notice that Jared doesn't get a break. The priest does this, the priest does this, the priest does this. So the current prayer book's involvement of the laity was a significant change from prior practice in Anglicanism. So let's dig into some of that history. So first off, the theology of a licensed Eucharistic minister. A Eucharistic minister is what's known as an extraordinary ministry in the Episcopal Church. Not extraordinary in that it's super exciting or odd, but that it is extraordinary, is that it is outside the norm of how something ideally happens in the prayer book. So it's extraordinary that it's not the norm of our liturgy, but we see it all the time in almost any church you go to for reasons that you will find out. So let's unpack why that is a little bit here. First off, let's look at the Catechism. Catechism asks, what is the ministry of a priest? And the answer is, the ministry of a priest is to represent Christ in his church, particularly as pastor to the people, to share with the bishop in the overseeing of the church, to proclaim the gospel, to administer the sacraments, and to bless and declare pardon in the name of God. That's my job. That's my calling as a priest. Ministry of a deacon, to represent Christ in his church, same as the first line for priest, particularly though as a servant of those in need, first and foremost, and to assist bishops and priests in the proclamation of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments. It's from this you get this wonderful line. The farther a priest gets from the altar, the further the priest gets from their vocation. When priests are running out doing all kinds of things unrelated to the sacraments of the church, they could be losing sense of vocation. Similarly, the more time a deacon spends around the altar, as opposed to at the door of the church and outside of the church, the farther a deacon gets from their vocation. The deacon has a vocation at the altar, but their primary vocation is servant of those in need. So that's one of the differences between those two orders of ministry in the Episcopal Church. So let's look at laity now. That's you all, is to, once again, represent Christ in his church. Everyone has that apparently. In addition for laity, to bear witness to him wherever they may be, and according to the gifts given them, to carry on Christ's work of reconciliation in the world, point 2. And then point 3 is to take their place in the life, worship, and governance of the church. So that's the ministry of a lay person. That's your baptized ministry. It kind of gets back to why we said the reason they got rid of those liturgies for commissioning lay ministers is because what you do in the life, worship, and governance of the church, that is the third most important thing you do as a baptized Christian. That's third in it. The first important thing is the way you bear witness to Christ in the world, no matter where you are. The second most important thing is to be a part of reconciliation in the world according to your gifts. And then after that, what you do in the church. That's how the ministry of laity functions according to the catechism and our theology as Episcopalians. Now, I want to draw your attention to something here. For a priest, administer the sacraments. So first for me, pastor to my people, that's my number one job. I share with the bishop in oversight in the proclamation of the gospel, administer the sacraments, bless and declare pardon. That's me. Deacons assist in the administration of sacraments. That's core to their ministry. Lay people take their place in the life, worship, and governance of the church, but it does not say anywhere in there that they administer sacraments. You notice that? That's an oddity of the catechism. Let's push through and figure out what we're going to untangle here. Let's look at the rubrics. Oh yeah, go ahead, Nancy. 1979. Has not really been significantly edited since then. Yes, it does reflect equality in ordination. Good question. Next, let's get the rubrics. This is from the concerning the service before the service of Holy Eucharist. It is appropriate for priests present to do this and to do the distributing of communion. Deacons should assist in the ministration. Lay persons should read the lessons and preach the gospel, may lead prayers of the people. Nothing about administering sacraments. Again, not in the rubrics at all. So we assume a chalice bearer is an essential ministry of the church. It's actually rubrically not. This is what I'm going to say. It's extraordinary that the normal thing is priests and deacons distribute communion. Lay people do it when you don't have enough priests and deacons, which is what you'll see next. And so these are the most important rubrics. After the service, there's additional directions. Those are the less important rubrics, but still rubrics important. And then there's a rubric that says, in the absence of sufficient deacons and priests, lay persons licensed by the bishop according to canon may administer the chalice, right? This was a huge change in allowance. And this change came from the developments of Vatican II and the liturgical renewal, because Vatican II also allowed lay people to distribute the chalice too when there weren't enough priests and deacons. But that was a change in the life of our church generally. So it's not normal to have lay people distribute the communion, but when you don't have deacons and priests, it's common. And as the Episcopal Church has shrunk over the past however many years since 1979, I know I don't want to do the math on how long that's been, the past 45 some years. The fact of the matter is barely any parishes have enough priests and deacons that laity don't distribute. I don't know if I know a single parish in the Episcopal Church where laity don't distribute the chalice, because we don't have a surplus of clergy anywhere anymore. So it's something that was extraordinary in the prayer book, but has become very common in our experience. So that's the first, I want to draw that out. So let's talk about what developed since the 79 prayer book, because of course 79 prayer book is 45 years old and our church is different now than it was then. So this is Beth Wickenburg-Ely's book, A Manual for Eucharistic Visitors. It's the handbook our Eucharistic visitors use that I used to train them for their ministry. So in 1985, first off, the seemingly hesitant allowance in the BCP for laity to distribute, as I said, it was a response to the liturgical movement, the idea that the laity should be more active in the Mass, and also that Vatican II had similar reforms. And so after the 79 prayer book, in 1985, 6 years later, General Convention passed a canon to allow lay people to take Eucharist to ill and infirm members and called them lay Eucharistic ministers. The canon also authorized them to assist with administering the chalice when there weren't sufficient clergy. That's a lem. How many of you were a lem at some point in your ministry? A lem, that used to be the term for this. And a lem was licensed for both taking communion to people who are sick and assisting in distribution when there aren't enough clergy. That was a lem. So that was 1985. Fast forward almost 20 years. And what we discovered in the next couple of decades is the gifts and skills needed to bring communion to someone who's sick are very different than the gifts and skill needed to serve in Mass distributing the chalice. In fact, they're almost entirely different. Visiting someone who's sick requires a sense of pastoral care, attention, the ability to have conversation, all of this stuff. Whereas distributing communion at the Mass, you don't have to say a single word other than the words of administration. It's a very different ministry. And so what happened then is they pulled those two ministries apart, and they created Eucharistic ministers and Eucharistic visitors. For a while, they were lay Eucharistic ministers and lay Eucharistic visitors, but in 2003, they also lopped lay off, because they figured there's no reason to specify this as a lay person. It's a Eucharistic minister, it's a Eucharistic visitor. So that's why the current language in our church is an Eucharistic minister, an EM, not a LEM anymore, or a Eucharistic visitor, an EV, and that's the language we use at St. John's. That's been the language in our church since 2003, which is once more another 20 years ago, God help me. A lot of churches have not kept up with this language, though, largely because very few priests spend as much time reading General Convention resolutions as I do. So that's either good for you or a punishment for you. I don't know what, so I have to figure that out. Now, before we move on, questions about this development. Nancy. Wonderful question. So Vatican II and the liturgical renewal movement, I've got a whole chapter in my book on Percy Dermer on this. The other book I already wrote. So if you haven't bought it yet, go buy a copy on Amazon.com. Percy Dermer Revisited. The liturgical movement began in the 19th century, ran through the early 20th century, and it was an ecumenical movement of liturgical scholars in Catholic, Lutheran, and Anglican traditions, all doing something that was known at the time as a part of the ressourcement. In French, for returning back to the original sources. So saying that the ideals for liturgy should be the way that liturgy was done in the early church before we were all divided. And what was amazing is before the liturgical movement, the worship in all of these traditions was very different. But because of the liturgical renewal movement, and if you think about it, this is the same time that you get the rise of the ecumenical movement with the World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches. So Christians are saying, we shouldn't be so different. We should do things similarly. So let's study together and find the best way to do things. And all of these things happened. One of them being, for example, the common lectionary. That if you go to your average Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal church, most of the time these days, odds are you can hear the same reading on any given Sunday, which is kind of cool, right? Other things happen around that time. One, for example, the document called Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, published by the National Council of Churches, which lays out the fundamental theology of Christianity for the theology of baptism, of Eucharist, and of ordained ministry for most Christians. And even though we have little points at which we're different on, it really was a discovery of how much we share in common. So during the time of Vatican II was doing their own liturgical changes. We were doing our liturgical changes that Anglicans and Lutherans were as well. And it's not like Vatican II did it, so we did it. It's more like the liturgical renewal movement suggested it, and it was implemented in each of these churches in very similar ways. But it was all in conversation. And of course, for Episcopalians, the liturgical renewal movement been saying this. The whole Catholic Church changed on this. So yeah, we want to be a part of that change. What's been unfortunate since that time is we've really, in many ways, fractured again. And we don't have near the sharing we had in the middle of the 20th century for a lot of this, which is an unfortunate reality. Any other questions on this piece? So, they do indeed. Yep, they do. And this is actually another point to make about using Eucharistic. I'm pretty sure in the Catholic Church, it's still restricted only to the chalice. If you notice, our prayer book says, where does that red come from? So bizarre. One second. That's throwing me off. Let me turn the share screen back on. 1 second. I think I had bumped a button to make notes on the page and accidentally. All right. So if you notice, and according to the rubrics, you're only allowed to administer the chalice. However, our canons allow you to administer the bread or the chalice, and the canons do that because of the doctrine of concomitance, that is, Christ is fully present in the bread and the wine. So if you just have one, so they said theologically saying you can't distribute one or the other, it's incoherent because both of them are fully the presence of Christ. But it's one of those interesting things where our rubrics really should be corrected at this point in the prayer book to say bread or chalice, because it's currently a place where our canons are out of step with our rubrics. So I think in the Catholic Church, to get your question, Robert, it's just the chalice still. I could be wrong. Whereas in our church, it's chalice or bread. In practice at St. John's, we have had people distribute the bread and assist in that. I found it created more problems than it helped, because when people wanted a blessing and it was a layperson, no matter what I did to try to say what you do, it got hard. And after the pandemic, more people want blessings and don't take communion. So it was just one or two people, it wasn't a big deal. But now that still a lot of people are, anxious about taking communion, I wanted to be sure that there's always a priest in front of them at some point for a blessing. So that's why I made that change after the pandemic when we came back to worship. Any other questions about this? Yeah.
Not a question, just a comment. In most Roman parishes that I've been to the past several years, for funerals, weddings, whatever, they don't even pass the chalice anymore. It's just right.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. When I went to a J.C. Howe funeral, J.C. was someone I deeply loved, big mentor to me when I was a kid in high school, and I went to his funeral, and everyone just took the bread. No one touched the chalice. I also, and it was just the priest distributing the bread. They had a line in the bulletin somewhere about a blessing, but I was dressed in my clerical clothes, and I absolutely went up, and I could see the priest sweating bullets. Because he thought I was going to try and take communion, but I walked and he crossed my arms like this, and he gave me a little blessing, and I went and sat down. But I was, JC would have enjoyed that moment. I think.
Well, he would have encouraged.
He would have.
Well, if you go to the Catholic Church and they say all baptized Catholics are welcome, I go off because I'm Catholic.
Yeah.
There's 4 branches.
Greg likes to cause trickies. So let's move on. So this is Eucharistic ministry, but now this is another reality. And this is where I got out of my Parsons Handbook work. I want to now take you back to medieval Christian worship and talk to you about the ministry of a subdeacon. How many of you have ever heard of a subdeacon? No? So no, okay. So we're going to talk about what a subdeacon is, because there's something here, and a big thesis of my current book is that this is a ministry that can be restored in our time under the auspices of a Eucharistic minister. So in the early centuries of the church, the subdeacon was a minor order, so they served below the deacon but above the acolyte. You have to remember, the early church, orders existed. It's called the nesting theory of ordination. So you're ordained on either to steps like this or steps like this. So there's the ordination to the ministry of acolyte, porter, all different minor orders that you'd be literally ordained to. And at each step of ordination, there's different things. So for example, when you rose to the order of subdeacon was when you took a vow of celibacy. Even though it was a minor order, not a major order of the church. And that's how it worked. So the order of subdeacon, and the subdeacon's job was to help the deacon and do some other key roles in the celebration of Mass.
So would you have to have a full-fledged deacon in the church to have a subdeacon?
Most churches would have, I would imagine, would have had them all if it was going to be a full Mass.
But if you didn't have a deacon, you wouldn't have anybody be a subdeacon.
I don't know for sure. Yeah, it's a good question. During the Reformation, the minor order of subdeacon was abolished in Anglicanism. Although the ceremonial roles related to what the subdeacon did continued in high church or Anglo-Catholic services. So subdeacon evaporated from our church with the Reformation in England, but in the Anglo-Catholic stream of the church, that person still did their job. They were just no longer ordained to the minor order of subdeacon. It became a role they filled as opposed to a minor order into which one was ordained. In today's Episcopal Church, the subdeacon is not a formally recognized or ordained ministry, but it is a liturgical role that is filled by either deacons, priests, or specially trained lay people in Mass. It's an actual real thing. So let's talk about what a subdeacon does in Mass. Like I said, basically to assist the deacon, and thereby, of course, assist the priest. And the fundamental jobs are the subdeacon chants the epistle, they hold the gospel book for the deacon, they prepare the bread and the wine for the deacon and present them to the deacon at the offertory, often wearing a humeral veil over their shoulders to carry the bread and wine to the deacon, who then prepares the table. And they assist in the distribution of communion often as well. So that was the role of a subdeacon. In our own church, the epistle is now done by the reader, right? Subdeacon doesn't do that. For us, the verger holds the gospel book. A lot of times an acolyte will do that for the deacon as well. The crucifer assists the deacon in setting the table, right? In St. John's, at least. That's the crucifer's job. And the distribution of communion is, of course, the Eucharistic minister. So my point is that we don't have the minor order of subdeacon But all of these jobs still exist in the liturgy. There's still jobs that happen. At St. John's, we just parcel them out to different people. And in some churches, they've maintained the subdeacon. They keep those jobs unified in the office of subdeacon to some extent or another. Now, since none of you know what that looks like, what I'm going to show you now is what this looks like in an actual celebration of Mass. The church I'm going to show you is St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, one of the historic Anglo-Catholic parishes of our denomination. Wonderful church. What I love about St. Mark's is it is a very thoughtful Anglo-Catholic parish. So, for example, though they have their altar still in the east end of the church, and some of the liturgy is celebrated with the priest and the ministers facing the altar, eastward facing, during the canon of Mass, you'll notice they come to the other side of the altar and face the people. So they're kind of doing a little bit of both and. So you'll see that in the video I'm going to show you. This is about a 10-minute video because I wanted to capture some of the movements of this so you could see what it looks like with each of these people doing their jobs. That sound good? Yeah. You will. You'll see everyone. You see everyone else, and you'll see the extra person of subdeacon in there. You can tell who the subdeacon is because the priest is wearing the chasuble, right, with the Y orphrey on it, normally on the back. The deacon and the deacon is wearing a dalmatic, which is a square-shaped green vestment that has 2 orphreys on it. The subdeacon is wearing the same garment, but 1 orphrey on it. So that's how you can tell the difference between the deacon and the subdeacon. You also notice, for example, that when they're on the steps of the altar, the priest is on the first step, the deacon on the second, the subdeacon on the third. You'll see that as well. That'll be another way you'll see them work differently. So let me see if this works, and we will hope. This is actually their liturgy this past Sunday. There's the Verger right there. Then you got subdeacon, deacon, priest. The female celebrating this particular service. You can go side. Subdeacon, so if subdeacon side, you can step side priest in the center. Grab friends. Right, that the deacon on the right there, the little subdeacon on the left. And the cross. And he says the altar. Gonna become acceptable. Just stand in front. Yeah, he's in front of the deacon and subdeacon. Get past the Lord at the end of the Lord. That's the glory of the Lord. That cool is that. Then they go to the side for collect of the day. This is also going to go so slide gospel side stuff that Greg knows about. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here again. I'm going to go into the feet for the lessons. So now we're at the preparation of the altar. So we skip ahead to that. You see the deacon is setting the altar with the subdeacon on his left to assist. The person giving stuff to the subdeacon, who then helps giving stuff to the deacon. The deacon serving this mass is David Cobb, who's actually the current interim rector of the church. David's the present time. So he's not a vocational deacon, permanent deacon, just taking the role with the staff. Some deacon facing the deacon, everything's prepared. That is the crucifer for Atlas, who is the second, who's helping the subdeacon. Large is the priest, so then the priest takes her spot, deacon takes his proper spot to the right, priest osculates, priest makes sure everything. But this church also has a lot of private prayers they do, so that you're going to see them do now. They provide a liturgy service that you won't hear, go to that service, but she doesn't privately hear. Because of course there's a solo singing. Thanks to the altar, the third gives it to the deacon, gives it to the priest. That's the gifts.
Subdeacon, incense the choir and the people.
No, the third will do that. Subdeacon's only job is to help the deacon and priest to do that at the altar. But then one of what's known as the three sacred ministers for a full mass. In some churches, what you'll see when they do the sensing is the deacon and subdeacon will actually hold back the chasuble from the priest's hands when they're sensing to make sure the chasuble can come to the purple. When I used to work at St. Paul's K Street, that's what we used to do. Then the deacon senses the priest. Gives it to the third.
Jared, the priest gets 3,
Doubles.
and the lay person gets 2.
Yeah, deacon. And so then Sursum Corda. So at this point, very similar to our style, other than you got an extra person on the left, you already got people going forward. And that's the end. So that's as far as, but that just gives you a flavor of what a full, let's call it a solemn high mass, what a solemn high mass with the 3 sacred ministers looks like. We don't have any churches that use the subdiaconate. There are some in the Diocese of Michigan in the Detroit area. And of course, you go into Northern Indiana, Chicago, then absolutely there are, but not in our diocese. So, oh my gosh, what does Jared want to do? Is what some of you may be thinking. I would love, of course, to adopt the tradition of a solemn high mass, eastward facing, all 3 sacred ministers, but I know St. John's Episcopal Church. My God has always done that. As much as I love that style of liturgy, that's not who this community is. And I'm very aware of that, and that's not something I'm trying to do at all. So I want to be, first I want to be super clear. I'm not saying now, don't get me wrong. If we ever grew enough as a parish that we added a 3rd celebration of Mass in English, what I would do is 8:30 Mass, 9 o'clock family Mass, like where our current 10 o'clock is, and then 11 o'clock solemn high Mass. That's what I would do if I had the money and the attendance to pull it off, but we are certainly not there today. However, it seems to me that the understanding of the Eucharistic minister as the modern implementation of the minor order of subdeacon, thus serving as one of the sacred ministers of the altar, no matter the style of Mass, is fitting and appropriate. So to have the Eucharistic minister as one of the full-on sacred ministers of Mass, as opposed to someone kind of hanging out with the chancellor who just comes up to distribute a chalice. So you may be asking yourself, well, that's an interesting question. I still feel like this is a lot of talking on a Monday evening in the summer that I don't know what anything you're actually suggesting is. So let's talk about Vesture. All right, so I'm glad you asked what this has to do with Vesture. I'm glad you asked. That's funny. There are 2 basic types of vesture in the church. There's choir dress and there's Eucharistic dress. Choir vestments are black cassock, white surplice, and then for clergy, the black tippet, their academic hood, and if they are particularly appropriate, their hat. This priest is wearing a Canterbury cap, as I also like to wear. If you know me, you've ever seen me in choir dress. Eucharistic vestments are cassock, amice, and alb. So you see you've got the cassock is the black robe, right? The amice, the alb, and which is often nowadays combined into a cassock alb. We'll talk about that in a minute. With the girdle tied around. And then for ordained people, they have a stole and a chasuble. They may or may not have a manifold if they're fancy. A deacon also has a stole and a dalmatic. That's how that works. So there's a choir vestments and mass vestments. They're 2 different vestments in the church. What's the cassock alb, you may ask? This is the woefully allowed practical creation of Olney in the 20th century. They invented the cassock alb for the purpose of making it easier to get dressed for Mass. So traditionally, you have your cassock, you then put on your amice, you put on your alb, you put on your cincture, and it's this practice of getting ready. You'll notice I wear both, but I try most of the time to wear my amice, alb, and cincture, because for me, that slows me down in getting ready for Mass. It forces me to pray a little bit more, and that's probably a good thing. It's also practical because if you've ever been serving in the liturgy, you may notice you have a tendency to perspire. And if you're wearing an amice, that amice is what collects the sweat from your neck. So your alb isn't getting dirty. And you just throw the amice in the wash and it's just a square piece of fabric, so it's super easy to keep clean. So it's actually kind of practical as well. However, Almi said that's too much work. So we're going to tell you, what if instead of wearing a cassock, an amice, an alb, and a girdle, you just combine them all into one heavy white garment? So the alb I wear when I dress like this, you'll know, is a very light alb. It's a very light fabric. It's fuller, kind of gathers at the waist. So they took this and they made it heavier, so it's the weight of a casket all combined. Instead of an amice, they built a collar up around it to go around your neck. And it's basically the same garment. One of my friends calls it the sausage skin of convenience. Because the other reality of a cassock alb is they tend to be close fitting, and so they reveal a multitude of sins. No one looks good in a cassock alb. You got your gut kind of sticking out, it's all kind of tight around you. Whereas in a traditional alb, because it's a large garment that is tied together, the folds of the garment kind of lovingly cover everything. So that's why it's also a little bit of vanity why I wear it. No, I wear my cassock alb at St. John's, particularly at Wednesdays and other times. So it is a vestment that exists. It's not my preferred vestment as a priest, however. So all that says, so for Eucharistic minister, then there are two approaches to vesting them. You could vest them in choir vestments of cassock and surplice, or in mass vestments of cassock amice alb, or more accurately nowadays a cassock alb and a girdle. Those are kind of the two approaches. And of course, I mean, if it's a big feast day and you do have a beautiful tunicle in dalmatic, you throw that on top of the alb and they look gorgeous. That's an option always, of course. So on a big feast day, a properly vested Eucharistic minister would be in cassock amice alb or cassock alb girdle and tunicle. That's the subdeacon right there. You may be asking, just to reiterate, the difference between a tunicle and a dalmatic, because it does look like two deacons. And once again, pay attention. The deacon, remember, is going to wear a stole underneath their dalmatic. That's difference one. Difference two is that traditionally the tunicle has one orphrey and the dalmatic has two orphreys. So you can see the difference there, if that makes sense. That's actually a lovely cloth of gold set I found online, just beautiful. So the question is an EM properly someone in choir dress? That is, or is they someone properly in Eucharistic dress? So if they're in choir dress, this is a lay person in cassock and surplice who sits in the chancel until it's time to assist with the distribution, at which point they simply come forward and distribute. That is what we currently do at St. John's, and that's why we do it at St. John's, because I'm not seeing them as a sacred minister at the altar. Their only job is to sit in the choir, and so that's why they're dressed like someone in the choir. Like that's why our choir wears cassocks and surplices, right? So they're just someone in the choir who comes up when it's time to distribute communion. Or should a Eucharistic minister actually be understood as a sacred minister, and therefore they should be wearing Eucharistic dress? They should be moving with the priest constantly, all are wearing alb, priest, deacon, and Eucharistic minister throughout the Mass. So, for example, in this role, when we enter, we would enter like you saw before, that you'd have the Eucharistic minister, deacon, and priest, or we'd split, and it'd be Eucharistic minister to this side, deacon to this side, priest to this side. We'd reverence there all together, then go to our seat. But where the Eucharistic minister would actually move with the priest as a part of the liturgy, as opposed to just being someone tipping a cup. And that is the end of my presentation, and the point at which I invite questions, thoughts, reflection, and feedback. Sarah.
So we have two Eucharistic ministers that would come up front. Now, are you suggesting that we wear the white cassock, all that all in one, but you're not suggesting what a subdeacon and a deacon would wear at the same time?
Yeah, so what I would say is, if we went with this change, I'd buy a set of cassock albs, because let's be honest, you all aren't gonna wear cassocks and amices and albs. I mean, I'd love for you to do that, but I'm not gonna. Now, of course, I would say any person who wanted to dress traditionally, I would invite them to purchase their own alb to wear over their cassock, because you all have cassocks that fit you already, right? Because you have them from the cassock and surplice you already wear. So to add an amice and alb to that would be easy. It also technically would be cheaper, because albs are so big that you only worry about having different heights of them. So you really only need a handful of albs and amices, because they all kind of gather nicely. So that it'd be cheaper, but for ease of everything, I'd probably buy you all cassock albs, which is basically what the acolytes wear right now. It's what you see the crucifer and the torchbearers, when we have torchbearers, wear. So yeah, what I would say is I'd buy enough of those for you to wear cassock albs. And now, I currently have a little proposal that floats for buying a new set of vestments for Christmas and Easter that would be cloth of gold, similar to what you saw in that picture, but not that picture specifically. That would be specifically for Christmas and Easter to highlight those two great feasts. They'd only be used on those days. And if I did do that, I'd buy a tunicle as well, because my quote for it is chasuble, dalmatic, and everything. I'd add a tunicle on as well, so that at Christmas and Easter, you're dressed like that. Now, if I don't have a deacon, I wouldn't put a tunicle on a layperson, because without a deacon serving, it doesn't really make as much sense. Though what I might do is to have one of the priests in our church serve as deacon of the mass, or I would serve as deacon of the mass, in which case they would wear the dalmatic and do the deacon's job, and a layperson would wear that. So probably not the tunicle, though I'm not ruling it out for the future, as we buy vestments looking ahead, particularly on super high days like Christmas and Easter. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Sarah? Greg?
So currently, what would your preference be? So whenever I am adult crucifer, I always put the white robe in the hood.
Yep, the cassock alb.
Is that your preference, or if I were an adult acolyte, you don't care if I were wearing cassock and cotta?
Yeah, when people are wearing, well, not a cotta is a short, that's what the choir wears. They wear a cotta. The surplice goes all the way down.
Okay.
So currently what I do is, if people are serving in two roles, I try to think what vestment makes the most sense for them. So usually if a person is serving as crucifer and Eucharistic minister, I have them wear an alb, just because that's generally what they wear when you're crucifer. Though at times I've had them wear cassock and surplice as well. I don't know. But that question right there gets to the confusion of our current practice for me. Is that why am I vesting the acolyte carrying the cross as a sacred minister in an alb, but I'm vesting the Eucharistic minister, who has to be licensed by the bishop to do that, in cassock and surplice? No, the reason I made that choice, 12, 13 years ago, was because I was trying to lean in to the kind of those who like the low side of worship at St. John's, because the more lower approach is always going to be a cassock and surplice as opposed to Eucharistic vestments. But that like, I don't think I need to lean there anymore very much. And and the more I've thought about it, the more I've disagreed with my earlier decision. Because at first I'm like, no, the ministers at the altar and our prayer book are the deacon and the priest. That's what the prayer book says. They don't say anything about a Eucharistic minister, because once again, it's an extraordinary thing, right? And so that's why I said, there's cassock and surplice, will sit with the choir and come up to communion, because that's the theology of the 79 prayer book. However, as I hope this presentation has demonstrated, we have developed as a church since then. And at this point, I think the way our canons are, and the way we actually function in most Episcopal churches, is that a Eucharistic minister is ordinary again. And should be reflected in the way we do worship. And I think probably the prayer book needs to be, in the next revision of the prayer book, it should be revised to see a Eucharistic minister as an ordinary minister as well, not an extraordinary minister as the current prayer book. So it was kind of it was low church, it was my prayer book stuff that why I did cassock and surplice. But at this point, 12 years later, I keep questioning and doubting whether I made the right decision there. If that makes sense.
It does. So would you prefer the Eucharistic ministers to wear the owl and then the crucifer to wear the casket and so?
Oh, no, I'd keep the crucifer and alb as well. That would basically be the altar party. Because if you saw St. Mark's, Philadelphia, that's what all of the acolytes, the thurifer I would put in an alb as well. The thurifer, I'd have everyone in an alb, who's in the altar party. And the people who are in choir dress would simply be the choir, or the other person who is in choir dress is if there's a guest preacher who is not serving at the altar. So for example, if Canon Sunil was coming to preach, if he was not going to distribute communion, but was just going to preach, he would wear a casque and surplice. Or similarly, there are a few times that I used to do this when Father Kenneth would celebrate, and I would just show up I would just preach because he liked to celebrate more than he needed to, and which I was happy to do. So when he celebrated and I preached, I would wear casque and surplice. Unless I'm distributing communion, at which point I would wear Eucharistic vestments, because I'm going to be an altar party person there. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, reflections? Anyone online? I want to be sure you all feel able to contribute. I don't know if any of you have thoughts you want to share. I'm happy to say them with a larger group. Rebecca.
I do.
Rebecca?
You go first, Casey.
Oh, okay. I was just curious, now, are there going to be requirements for the, what you're calling the EVs to wear vestments to the people's homes and nursing homes?
Our church has not had people, when they bring communion to people's homes, wear vestments. That's not been the tradition of the church for a long time. And even when I visit people at home to bring them communion, I don't, because really a Eucharistic visitor is a fully separate and distinct ministry at this point. They're bringing communion outside of the office of Mass. Good question.
The reason I ask that is I'm very familiar with, since I was in sales for so many years. I started out as a sales rep, and then I became a sales manager, regional sales manager, and a director. And, calling on people has never been a problem for me.
Yeah. Rebecca.
And finding out their needs. So go on.
Thanks, Casey. What was your question or comment, Rebecca?
Well, I mean, my comment is, I appreciate one of the things in general about Vesture is that it very clearly communicates sort of what everybody is doing or why they are where they are. I mean, it's one of the things that I appreciated coming into the Episcopal Church too, because let's face it, we got lots of it. But that's really nice to be able to walk in and see, okay, this is what, and I appreciate the consistency that the cassock alb use would bring, because now I can see how there is such a big inconsistency of, okay, part of the altar party is wearing it, those ordained and our crucifer, but yeah, then suddenly the EMs are like the odd ones out. And this would bring back the consistency and I think better clarify who is doing what. Which I think is nice in a service. You don't have to guess who's going to do what, because you can tell based on what they're wearing. And there's something very nice about that. They're wearing sort of the role. And so I appreciate the consistency I think that would bring to the service, so there isn't this sudden break in that role. And especially it does highlight the ordinary reality, because I don't know if I've worshiped in an Episcopal church recently, except for at a conference where we suddenly had like 40 priests. So, everybody doing everything was a priest. Like, other than that, you're always going to have an EM. And so sort of marking them as part of that makes so much more sense. I don't know. So that's my comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you for that. And seeing where people are also another point that I'd make about this. If you noticed at St. Mark's, Philadelphia, their altar area is pretty big. So the entire altar party sits behind the chancel steps. I mean, behind the altar rail, right? So there's the choir and the chancel, and then behind there's chairs behind the altar rail where the altar party sits, because they're clearly in two different places doing two different jobs. This is one of the difficulties with our altar arrangement at St. John's, is I have to celebrate the liturgy of the word from the chancel, because there's frankly no place for me up at the altar during the first part of Mass. But eventually someday, if we ever did do a reconfiguration of the chancel to make the altar area a little bigger, to make it more fulsome, more centric, the way I think it should be, what I would absolutely do is I would have the altar party sit there and I'd only have the choir and the chancel, to once again separate out those two areas by the two different responsibilities each group has, which is the more common practice in most churches. We just don't have what the great line you learn in seminary is the architect, no matter what you think is best, the architecture always wins. And the architecture currently wins in what we do at St. John's in terms of where people sit, even though I recognize that that's not my ideal practice. Nancy, I saw your hand up. Yeah, great question. It would be the exact same amount of people serving we currently have. Not every offering of Mass has to have 3 sacred ministers. You only have to have 3 sacred ministers if it's a solemn high Mass. So I would shoot for having a deacon and then only 1 EM when we had those more special services. But the rest of the time, I'd have 2 EMs serving in that role with no deacon, and they would just be vested in just plain cassock alb. Or if I only need 1 EM, I just have 1 EM serving. So the reason I have a second EM isn't because I need 3 people at the altar. The reason I have a second EM is because I need that many people to distribute communion at 10 o'clock. So the 8:30 service, the midweek noon service, so I'd only need 1 EM, would just be that single Eucharistic minister serving with me still. Good question, though. Exactly where they sit now. What we would do is we'd move a little more together. So we'd reverence together at the altar, then we'd go to our seats. They'd go to the altar and they'd be standing at the altar as the Eucharistic minister. What I'd probably do is actually have them stand with me at the altar up here, as opposed to where they stand right now outside by the organ. I'd slide them up right here with me at the altar. And then if we have a deacon, of course, that would make sense because I'd have deacon, priest, subdeacon, or Eucharistic minister. So when if I ever get a deacon again, I would have that, they'd all be up there, but I'd pull them closer up to the altar right with me to be clear that they are part of the altar party doing the liturgies. And then, yeah, so that would be the other change in where they stand. But there's no seats for us as an altar party anywhere else, so we have to sit in the chancel right now. Other questions?
I have another one.
Oh, go ahead, Casey.
Where I came from the deep South, 28 years in an Episcopal church that where we have a lot of retirees that are priests and deacons, retired deacons, and also choir members have chosen to become chalice bearers. So typically they just pop around when they're needed. And we have one priest in the choir. She's a retired priest from New England, and another priest for a while he was in choir, retired priest. So they would wear their white robe, just a plain white robe and then they would serve as like a extra person at the altar. Is that something that if the congregation grew, would you allow choir members to be both?
Yeah, so 2 questions here I'm hearing. First off, yeah, if we had enough, retired or semi-retired priests and deacons in the church, I would absolutely be having them serve as much as they want. And that is because even though it is common to have an EM, if I had clergy who wanted to serve at the altar, I would never tell a clergy person they couldn't serve because I wanted to have more lay people at the altar. Because for a clergy person, that is your fundamental vocation is up there. So if I have that, the clergy I've had in St. John's have been very content to be in the pews, who are retired. They have not wanted that, with the exception of Father Kenneth, who did want to be up at the altar. The secondary question, so if a choir member is also a Eucharistic minister, that gets into that dual role Greg was saying, would they vest as a Eucharistic minister, or would they vest at and hang out with us and just go to the choir to sing the anthem? Or would they vest as a choir member and just come up to the altar for the distribution? I'd probably work that one out in conversation with Nick Palmer.
Okay.
See what he would think, because either of those approaches would work, since during the anthem they're not doing anything special anyways. So if he wanted to have them just cross over to the chancel and stand there for the anthem and then come up to the altar at the end of the anthem, that wouldn't work if they're singing a communion anthem, but we already have that reality, because if they're serving it up at the altar, they can't obviously go down. And I think most of our, I'm trying to think, Phyla, I think most of our choir members or Eucharistic ministers, I think it's just you, it's Rick, most of them, and you and Rick generally don't do choir and Eucharistic minister at the same time. Very rarely. Yeah, so I'd ask Nick what he would prefer probably. Yeah, Nancy, do you have a thought on that? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I actually have a friend of mine who's a priest who is in their choir, and he does that. He, during the choir anthem, he in his priest vestments goes to stand with the choir and sing. I've always thought I'd love to do that because I do miss being in the church choir. But we also have the custom at St. John's of healing prayers during the offertory, so I'm busy, so it also doesn't work very well. But yeah, kind of did do that. So it wouldn't be that approach of having them be with the altar party the whole time and just go to be with the choir for that would not be out of the norm too far.
Like, Jared Cramer, usually they sit on demand or I was there, and it's kind of quiet.
Yeah.
It's not a lot.
Yeah.
Which I think sometimes.
Yeah, it is a nice kind of, and then they join kind of sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, Greg.
Do you think, have you ever thought about using either Father Daniel or Father Wesley as in the role of deacon, so you would have that other?
Yeah, so if we did go through with this change and kind of move to more of the three sacred ministers approach, I probably would let Father Wesley and Father Daniel know that if they would like to be a little more active and to serve as deacon of the Mass, at least on the 7 principal feasts of the church, when we should on those 7 days have it, have the full complement. In addition, if they ever wanted to on a regular Sunday, that they could. Right now, both of those are clergy who are very happy in the pew. They're just very content there. But I would definitely give that invitation to them. I also have a bit of an allergy theologically to priests serving as a deacon, because it really is a different order. And that's my deep desire, is that someone named Tom Johnstone is successful in discernment. But we can get a deacon back at St. John's eventually, because particularly when the person serving as deacon is the person you see doing that servant ministry as well. There's something that to me as well, is if you have all three, there's a beauty of the priest who cares for people, preaches, that does sacraments, the deacon who's justice ministry, and the lay person who's there as the lay representative of the laity at the altar. All three of them at Mass. There's a beautiful symmetry to that I love. So I'd love to get there eventually if I could. Yeah, Nancy.
But on the other hand, if you were to roll it out, most people are very. So what would be the plan to make people where that?
Yeah. A few different things. I'd make this video available to anyone who wanted to watch it, who was curious. I do think that 85% of the people of the pews would probably not even notice that you were wearing different vestments. Or that you were going to the altar with me and then to your seat, as opposed to your seat immediately. I think most people that for most of our services of Eucharist, particularly since we don't have dalmatics and tunicals really, the average person in the pew would not even notice. 15% of people who do notice might be like, oh, you're wearing different clothes. And then I'd explain why, so what I do is I'd do a parish page article, I do an e-news article, and I'd mention it in service itself, probably. Be a little more fuller in the parish page, a little more fuller in the e-news. And then in the service itself, I'd be like, hey, you may notice that our Eucharistic Minister is doing something different. That's because we've done this shift. If you want to find out more, you can go to sjegh.com/whatever link I give to watch this video about where that comes from. And I could also do like a faith formation one-off on it later this year.
I mean, that you could say you could ask how many people would like to do this in faith formation session.
Yeah.
And it might even draw some people into some of those minutes.
Yeah, and that's why when I did this, I kind of did the invitation primarily to Eucharistic ministers. So I said anyone in the parish is welcome to come, but I wanted to be sure that the people serving in this ministry were hearing this conversation and that they thought this change made sense to them. Because I didn't want to do it if my Eucharistic ministers are like, eh. So the other thing I do is I'd push out something to the Eucharistic ministers in the MSP program with a link to this video, short explanation, parish page article, e-news article, mention it in mass, maybe a faith formation hour, so that people have plenty of opportunity to understand why. And I think even if people are confused, they'll probably just be like, why are they writing? I really don't think, I can't imagine anyone being offended at this change. Because it really, unless you really know your theology, the church I worked at in Alexandria, Virginia, the Eucharist ministers were Catholic alts. So in the Episcopal Church, this is very common. This is not Anglo-Catholic. That's what I want to, like, I have some Anglo-Catholic theology, why I think it's important, but the practice of EMs were actually the more common practice in our church is for EMs to wear alts and not Catholic surplice. I'm an oddity that I put you all in Catholic surplice. And I did that because of what the theology of the prayer book is, even if I would now quibble a bit with that theology. Yeah. Ah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I think people are gonna need to know what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, and so in the principal service on those 7 big days, I think the change might be a bit more noticeable, particularly if I ever did get dalmatics and tunicals to put you all in. But as well, I would only do that at the solemn high mass with incense. And generally, the people who show up to the services with incense are the sort of people who would think this was beautiful. And the people who don't like incense are the sort of people who would think this is silly. So there's kind of a little self-selecting that already happens with the use of incense. And really, because really in the end, on Sunday mornings, the only difference is you're wearing an alb instead of a cassock and surplice, which just makes you look more normal. And you're reverencing differently and standing up here as opposed to over here. So it's definitely a difference, but I don't know if for most people it would be a difference about which they would have sturdy opinions. But whenever I'd be like, hey, if you have questions about this, thoughts about this, let me know. And if 1 or 2 people are annoyed, then they can be annoyed. And if there's this huge outcry, then I'll have another gathering and we'll talk about it some more and see what people think. Yeah.
I think that would make it more special.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's the other thing I like about this. If we make this change, is it would make it easy for me to step up those big services a little bit more, because we've already built the framework for it in a low mass that we do most Sundays. So we've got that framework then to just go like this and step it up a little bit more for those big services on those 7 days is then easy to do. And of course, someday, who knows, we get to a point that we would do, and I something like on those 7 days, maybe even an adapted version of the eastward facing like they do at St. Mark's, that it's eastward facing for just those first parts of the mass and then facing the people for the other parts. I like that way they kind of modify that to kind of acknowledge people's preference there. But like I said, that's not a change I'm making anytime soon. That's just, I look at that and think, well, that's an interesting approach. Yeah, Nancy. Yes, liturgical east, not geographic east, liturgical east. Yeah, we're not an oriented church. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah, Nancy. Good question. What I'd probably, so the question would be, oh ye who are Eucharistic ministers, is my gut accurate that if I make this change, I should get cassicalbs, which is a little more work because of course they have to fit differently than a big alb over a cassock. Or no, or should I do the traditional alb that I wear, where I would have to teach you all how to put on an amice, how to wrap it, how to tie it, how to put it over top. My gut tells me that's too much. I would always let people do that if they wanted to, and I'd show them where they get the stuff from and how to do it. But my gut tells me, once again, for simplicity's sake, that it would make more sense for me to go ahead and have you all in cassicalbs. So is my gut correct here on that, would you say? Okay, so then what I would do is I would get the measurements of everyone who currently serves as Eucharistic minister. I would contact Trevor Floyd. I would be like, how many cassicalbs do I need so I can always have enough for 2 people to serve, of what sizes? That's what I did with the cassocks and surplices years ago, a decade ago. So I would do that and I'd find out how much I need. And so the question would be, how long will it take me to get those? My guess, if I emailed Trevor tomorrow, my guess is I wouldn't have any information. I probably wouldn't be able to get those to us. Probably take at least a month or so, unless they're all quick ship. So I'd ask him that as well. So this is probably something we'd roll out sometime in October or November, maybe around that time, depending on how long it takes me to get stuff. Yeah, we could even just start it at the start. So yeah, if it's timing out that I'm going to get stuff towards the end around November, then I would just have, it'd be a great thing to start with the first Sunday. And then that gives you an opportunity to do some teaching in advance and talk about now first Sunday of Advent, you're going to see something different. This is what you're seeing. This is why you're seeing it. Yeah. Yeah, and that I wanted to have this meeting now because what I want to do is what I could do, if you all think it'd be helpful, is we could start shifting the movement now in the current vestments when we do our worship ministry workshops on September 8th. Because I already have you all for that, and so it could be a kind of a gradual movement in, and I could give people a heads up as well. So I could train you for the different movements, not which once again really is just a different reverence and standing at a different point in the altar. So I could train you for that at the worship ministry workshops. You'd still be wearing cassock and surplice for now, but you could start getting used to that. And then when we get the albs in, we just switch the vestments out. And we'll see kind of when those come in and when we do that. I think that would actually I probably would be better. My gut says I should do it at the worship ministry workshop because I already have many of you there. And if I tell people in advance at these workshops, we're going to talk about a new way of doing things, so please be there, as opposed to if I do an extra meeting, right, how many people I'll actually be able to get for it. Yeah. Yeah, Nancy. Yeah.
That's the perfect time to.
Yeah. Well, and what I'd love to do as well, what several of my friends who don't have eastward facing regularly, what they do is the 4 Sundays of Advent, they do eastward facing, because the whole point of eastward facing is you're facing the direction of the rising sun, from whence Christ will come back. So in Advent, in that time of longing expectation that we all face the same way, and hopeful expectation of Christ coming to us once more, it's often a gentle way of introducing eastward facing to a church that hasn't had or hasn't experienced for a while. I wouldn't do that this year, but maybe in a future year, is that gives it like, we're just going to try it and it's just 4 weeks. Try it this is why we're doing it. See how it feels, see what you experience. It may feel odd. Live into that. See what that oddity is like. And so that might be, if I do the albs this year on Advent 1, and we all like this, and we start playing around with some of the other stuff at some of the high days, then when we get to Advent next year, we could also maybe ask if we want to try something a little different during Advent, just to give people different. And one thing I love about St. John's when it comes to worship, as your priest, is there's ever since the pandemic, there's much greater flexibility that people have for things not being the same. and trying something out, something being different. Because for a whole 2 years, every Sunday we did it differently. It felt like, and so I feel like that limbered us up as a congregation. And also, like, St. John's is just a lot more kind of curious and less anxiety driven these days. So I do think that it could be a fun experiment next year to try.
We have a lot of people.
Yeah.
They're gonna be a little more fun.
Yeah. Tom had a question in the chat asking, would this affect what the verger wears? The verger would wear the same thing, cassock with verger gown. You saw the verger in the video I showed you was wearing that vestment as well, so that would remain the same. And then he said, would we be able to pick which sense of vestments we want to wear? Only in the sense, all of you will wear albs, but I would let you choose if you wanted to have a traditional alb or if you wanted to wear the more cassock alb style. But if any of you wanted to learn how to wear the traditional alb and amice, I'd be happy to let people learn to do that. Yeah. They would remain dressed as verger because their primary duty is verging and their secondary is assisting with communion. Yeah. And that would probably be the principle I try to teach people, is what's really your primary duty. And even for people in the choir, maybe that'd even be the answer, is to ask them, do you see yourself primarily as a chorister who's just helping with communion this Sunday? Or do you see yourself primarily as a Eucharistic minister who's helping with the choir this Sunday? And let them decide. And if some of them decided they wanted to opt for EM, and some for that doesn't bother me, and let them choose the vesture that fits when it's like that, that could go either way. For verger, I think it's pretty clear that the verger is the verger that is dominant. But to let a chorister decide, what do you feel like is who you are? And someone like Kenneth would probably pick one. Someone like Rick might pick another, and that's delightful and lovely. Any other final comments or thoughts before we wrap up? Well, you've been very helpful. Thank you as well. Thank you for those online for your comments and questions, whether you spoke them or you put them in the chat. I'm grateful for it. I will save the recording of this video so that people who didn't see it can go ahead and access it later. And I will get to work tomorrow figuring out how to implement this. All right, go in peace, love and serve the Lord. Don't screw it up.